Okay. Hello, guys. I think that I am audible as well as visible. Okay. Hello, guys. It would be better if anyone can write down in the chat whether I am audible as well as visible. Okay. So let's start our today's discussion. Okay. Let's start. So in the last video, we have seen that how we have implemented use effect as well as use state hooks to implement this login functionality, isn't it? Let's choose this one. So over here, this is an input tag for email field. This is an input tag for the password field. Okay. We have seen that after entering a valid email, email was considered to be valid if inside the entire string there was an @ present. Okay. Similarly, we have checked for the password. If the length of the password was greater than 8, then it was a valid password. So whenever we have entered a valid email and a valid password, this login button becomes clickable. Okay? Clickable. And whenever we clicked on this button, then this email and password, that is the updated value of email and the updated value of password, was sent to the app component from the login component using callbacks. So whenever this form got submitted, on click of this button, a function was called, that is submit form handler. So the function that was called was submit form handler. So submit form handler was called. In this particular function, we used a callback to pass the email and password. And the callback that we have used to pass the email and the password was sent to the login component from the app component in form of props. Okay. And using props dot the function name, we were able to pass these two values back to the app component. And inside the app component, we saw that whether this combination of email and password is a valid admin or not. So we checked for the validity, that whether this combination of email and password is a valid combination or not, or is present in our admins or not. If this combination of email and password was a valid admin, then we just displayed or rendered the home component, which simply rendered the text successfully logged in. Okay. So this was the basic idea about our application that we have implemented using useState and use effect. Okay, so let's see our code for now. Okay, so this was our code in which we have implemented the login functionality. So what we were doing over here, we just implemented a form within which we have used a field or an input tag to take email as the first input, and similarly we have used another one to take the password. Then whenever there was a on change event in the input tag, this particular function was called, that is email change handler and password change handler, corresponding to any change in the input field related to email or password. And the most updated string that was entered inside the input fields were then used to update this particular states or the state variable, that is entered email and entered password. So this entered email and entered password were updated with each on change event on the input text. And finally, when we are done with the inputs, we clicked the button. Okay, so for clicking the button element, the button needs to be abled, that is clickable. Initially, whenever we entered these two particular values, that is email and password, if any of them were supposed to be invalid, then this form is valid state variable would have been false, and thus this button would have been disabled. But if we enter valid email ID and password, then this is set to true, and thus the value of disabled is false. Thus we can click on the button. Now, how we were setting the value for this particular form is valid state variable. So we were doing so inside the use effect, which was called every time there was an updation. Inside this use effect, we use the set timeout to actually check after 3 seconds whether our email and password are valid. If both are valid, then set form is valid is true, and thus form is valid is set to true. And after each of the update, whenever this was called, the previous state that was created using this set timeout was erased with the help of this cleanup function. Okay, so we have seen all of this in the previous video. Whenever there was a change in entered email or entered password, this use effect got invoked, the function within use effect got invoked, and finally the email and the password was checked whether it was true or false. If any of them were false, then form is valid is false. If both of them are true, then form is valid state variable was true. And this was invoked whenever there was any change in the entered email or entered password, and this cleanup function then cleared the previous state of this particular set timeout, that is form validation. Okay, so this is what we have studied so far. Okay, so far our discussion was related to use effect, use state, and how we can implement or combine them up to create a login implementation, isn't it? So now for this video, what we are going to do, so for this video we are going to implement the same functionality, but now we will be using useReducer. So let's see how we can do the same or achieve the same using useReducer. So this is one of the best way to understand how we need to implement useReducer, and also then we will be writing some logic in which we will be discussing about the working of useReducer in the latter part of the video. For now, let's continue with the implementation. So over here, I am going to comment this down because we do not need them anymore. So I'm going to comment this use states, that is the state variables that we have used over here. That is for form is valid, entered email, email is valid, entered password, and password is valid. And also I'm going to comment down the use effect hook. Okay. And now I am going to uncomment this particular line, that is constant. Then I have used useReducer. I have passed a reducer function that is going to deal with the actions that I'm going to do and finally return the updated states. And whenever it is going to return an updated state, the entire login component is going to be re-rendered. And over here, I am going to pass the initial state. Okay. So whenever I feed the reducer function and the initial state to the useReducer, it returns two values which I have destructured over here. That is the state which is being returned, that is the most updated state, and over here a dispatch function. The dispatch function is generally used to send the action that is going to be handled inside the reducer function. Okay. So let's implement. On implementing these ideas, the concept behind each of them will be clear to us. Okay. So first of all, as I have removed all these particular use state variables or state variables and the use effect hook, so we should also remove all these state updation functions, because as we are not using the state variables, so there is also no use of state updation functions. So let's remove them. Okay, so we are done with that part. Now let's see how can we continue with our useReducer. Okay, so over here we have understood that we have to fetch we have to provide it a function reducer and an initial state, and finally it is going to return the state and the dispatch function. The dispatch function is going to trigger the reducer function just by passing to it an action, and the reducer function is going to work on the previous state and the action that has been passed to it, and finally is going to generate the new state. So for that, over here I am going to use dispatch. Okay, and finally I'm going to pass an action, obviously. So the action would have a type. So it is not specific that you have to use type over here. You can use anything. For convenience, I am just specifying a type to my action. Now over here, I am entering the email ID. So I am going to use over here input email. Okay. And finally, as it is an object, I will use a comma to specify the next key value pair, that is nothing but value, to which I am going to assign a value that is event dot target dot value. So why am I doing so over here? This is because of the fact that whenever I am writing or doing an on change event in the input tag over here that is related to email, on change of a particular character or on change event being done on this input tag invokes this particular function, that is email change handler. So this particular function over here, that is email change handler, will be invoked, and thus within it I am going to store the most updated value that I have inserted or I have written inside my input tag inside this object with a specified key, that is value. Okay. Similarly, whenever there will be any change in the password field, I am going to generate another action inside the password change handler. So for that, I'm going to call the dispatch function. Then I'm going to pass it two things, that is type, to which I'm going to assign input password, and finally I'm going to assign it a value. that is event dot target dot value. So I'm done. So the most updated value corresponding to password has been stored inside this object, which has a field value, and corresponding to value I have stored the most updated password, but the type over here is input password. Similarly, over here the type is input email, but the value that has been stored corresponding to this key value is the most updated email. Now we are done with the dispatch function. This is going to provide an action to the reducer, that is this particular object. Now let's get back over here. So over here I'm going to use a dispatch, and just I'm going to specify a type over here. Okay, so let's specify the type over here. So the type is going to be input blur. Okay, now let's discuss what this actually means. Now I should enclose this inside an curly braces to create an object. Okay, now why am I using input type blur? This is due to the reason that if I am not doing any on change event and my focus is not on the input field, then validate email will be called. That is this function. So then I am going to trigger, or I am going to pass this action to the reducer function using the dispatch function. Whenever my reducer function will encounter this particular action, then it is going to use the value that was stored inside the previous state. Okay. So similarly over here, I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it over here. Okay. So we are done with the dispatch corresponding to each and every function call that is happening on various events being performed on the input tag. Okay. But we haven't dealt with the submit event till now, which we will be doing soon. So now, as the reducer function is going to return a state, okay, so we can access the email and the password from that state. And we have also seen that we need to pass an initial state to the reducer function, to the useReducer hook. So the initial state, let's define the initial state now. So constant initial state, which would be equal to an object which will be having three fields. The first one is email, which will be initially containing an empty value, empty string. After that, there will be and password, which will be containing an empty string again, and finally a flag that is going to make this button disable or clickable. Okay, so instead of form is valid, I'm going to use that flag. So let's get back to the flag. Okay, for now let's give it a value false. Okay, so we are done with the initial state that I'm going to provide to this useReducer. Okay, so as my state looks like this, so I can extract the email and the password using state.email and state.password, and similarly I can extract the flag using state.flag. So let's make the changes over here. Let's convert entered email to state.email. Similarly, let's convert entered password to state.password. Okay, let's see how we have written the password over here. So it's in small letter. So over here it will be in small letter too. So I'm going to pass on submit the most updated email and password, which is stored in state. We know So we can extract the email and the password using state.email and state.password. Okay. So we are done with this much. Now finally, what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to implement my reducer function, which is going to handle the states based on the different actions that we have passed with the help of this dispatch function. Okay. And the action that we are passing to the reducer is having either type and value combination or only type. We are using only type in the case when we are losing focus of the input tags, and we are passing a value whenever we are doing an on change event. So let's now implement the reducer function. Constant reducer. So over here I'm going to implement an arrow function. Now we know that the reducer function takes two parameters. The first one is state and the next one is action. Okay, so this is done. Now if action dot type is strictly equals to input email, then I'm going to do a certain task. That is, I'm going to return a certain kind of state, or I'm going to update the state accordingly. Now again, in the second part, in the second condition, I'm going to write else if it is not equals to strictly equals to input email, then it might be strictly equals to input password. And if it is not equals to input password, then it would obviously be input blur, isn't it? Now what am I going to return in this case? So return, I'm going to return an object for which I'm going to write email is nothing but action, because I need the most updated value of email, not the previous state which is present inside state. But I'm going to extract the most updated version of email from the value that I have passed over here in my action. That is using action dot value. Okay. Similarly, for the password, what I'm going to do, I am going to take the password from the state, as I am not updating the password in this kind of action, in which action type is equals to input email. So for that I can use state dot value or state dot password, because our state looks like this. So to extract password, I need to use state dot password. Okay. Now finally, what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to deal with the flag. Okay. Flag. So flag will be nothing but action dot value dot. So this is the email, so I will use includes @. And one more thing that I need to check over here is the password, state dot password dot length and it should be greater than 8. Okay. Now similarly, I'm going to copy it, control, and then paste over here. Over here also, I'm going to use state.email. Just I'm going to do the opposite over here because I'm updating the password. So I will use the email from the previous state. So state.email. Then for password, it will be action. Okay. Dot value. And finally over here, I'm going to make the same changes. That is action dot value dot length, and similarly over here state dot email, because this contains the email. Okay, so we are done. Finally, what I'm going to do for this one, that is when I lose focus out of the input tag, then I'm going to simply use state.email and state.password. I'm going to take the password and the email from the previous state itself. And this is all right. Just I'm going to change this over here for the password. Not password, okay? Okay, now let's include this. Now let's save it. Okay. Login. Reducer is not defined. Okay, let's see. Initial state is not defined. Entered. Okay. Okay, let's get back over here. Instead of using form is valid, I'm going to use state dot flag. Okay, I think it's working properly now. Okay, let's get back over here. Okay, let's enter the value that we have previously entered in our last lecture. This was the email ID, and the password that was stored in for the admin was QWERTY123. QWERTY123. Now if I click on login, it is successfully logged in. So we are able to implement the same functionality. Instead of using useState and useEffect, we are now able to do the same using useReducer, isn't it? Now let's try for some other kind of email rather than the one that we have in our admin. By login, then you can see that it's not displaying or it's not rendering the text that is successfully logged in. So our application is working fine. Now let's input the correct email, but let's change the password. Okay, let's write instead of 34. Now let's click on login. You can see that you cannot log in. So it's working absolutely fine. Now let's understand the logic. Okay. So let's understand the logic one by one. Okay. So we will try to decipher each and every concept that we have implemented in the code. So first I'm going to start with this because this is the most basic thing and the first thing that you need to write while you are using useReducer. So over here I'm using useReducer. This is nothing but a React hook, which is very much important. And why it is important? This is because of the fact that using this particular hook, we can eliminate the case where there is a dependency existing. So let's understand this in a more detailed way. So whenever a state variable in React application depends on another state variable, then sometime it might give unexpected results, because the state variable on which the other one is depending might not be in the most updated form. So to remove those kind of dependencies, we use the React hook, that is useReducer. And thus it is preferred more than use effect when there is a dependency. And again, in one of the cases in which useReducer is used is when the initial state or the state that we are updating is a complex one and it's not a primitive one. Got it? So in these two cases, we will be using useReducer. Now let's understand the syntax. So over here, we are using useReducer. We are using this reducer function, which will be called whenever we will be passing an action through this dispatch function. So this dispatch function is going to pass an action to the useReducer. Based on that action, the useReducer is going to update the state. And finally, it is going to return the most updated state. And over here, we need to pass an initial state to give or to make the useReducer aware of the structure of our state. Whenever we do that for the complex states. And this is the state in which the most updated state will be existing, and we can extract each and every kind of fields that are inside this state just by using state, then dot, then the name of the field. So this is what our useReducer works like. Okay, and it is very much important. Now let's understand the next part, that is inside each of these functions which are getting triggered on various events. Okay, these functions are getting triggered during various events. Okay, okay. So what are these functions actually doing? So inside this function, we are again triggering the reducer function just by using our dispatch and passing the type of action. So whenever we lose input or focus on the input, whenever we lose the focus on input tags, this particular dispatch is going to trigger the reducer function just by passing this action, that is type, which is input blur, and it is passed in form of an object. Similarly, whenever we lose focus of the password field, this is passed. So in case of losing focus, these two actions are same that we are passing, because in both of them, what we are supposed to do, we are supposed to access the previous state's email and password, that is from state.email and state.password. Okay, now let's understand what these two functions are doing. These two functions are email change handler and password change handler. They are called on change of an event. So over here I am putting the type of the event, And along with that, in the value part, I am putting the most updated value inside the input tag. That is event.target.value and event.target.value. And this is the object that is being passed to the reducer to return the most updated state. So this is how a dispatch look like. And I have also given you a brief idea about the useReducer. Now let's understand about the reducer function, which is the main part over here. And also over here, I would like to mention one more important factor. That is, whenever we are clicking on the submit button, what happens is we have already entered the most updated value in the input tags for password and email. Thus, the state contains the most updated form of value corresponding to email and password. So we can easily access the email using state.email and password using state.password. And we can also activate or make the button clickable just by using state.flag over here to access the flag. Okay, because this flag will be true only when the password and the email that has been entered is valid. Now let's understand the reducer function. Okay, so what we are doing over here, so this function is responsible for taking old state, that is the previous state, and the action to be performed on the state. And after this action, based on this action, this old state is converted to new state. So this is the basic job of the reducer function. Let's understand how it is doing the job. So over here, the state and the action has been taken as arguments or parameters. Like the state contains the previous state and action contains the action. Now, if the action dot type is input email, that is, there is an on change event that has happened in the input tag corresponding to email. So I am going to take the most updated value of email. So that is not present inside state.email, but is present inside the object that we have passed to the reducer function using the dispatch function corresponding to the value key. So action.value will fetch me that email. Similarly, I will be using password, the old one over here, because I'm not updating the password because it is corresponding to input email type. So I will use state.password. I will access the old one from the state. And finally, I will be checking whether the most updated value of email and the password satisfies the criteria or not. If it satisfies, then flag is true. Similarly, for the password, we will take the value from action.value for password, but for email, we will be extracting the value from the previous state because we are not changing the email. Similarly, we are going to see over here whether the email and the password are valid by using the same condition. But over here, you need to consider the fact that as we are doing it corresponding to the password, so I will be using action.value.length. So for password, I'm going to use action.value, and for email, I'm going to use state.email. Now let's understand the last one. So in the last point, it is quite clear that for the email, I'm going to use the email value that is stored inside the previous state. Similarly, for the password, I'm going to use state.password because this will be returned only when in case of losing focus of the input tags. Okay. So in these two cases, as there is no unchange event, so we can directly use the previous state values. So that is state.email and state.password. And again, I'm going to check for the validity of flag, that is both the conditions should satisfy. And finally, when we are done with all the changes, we have the most updated state, which we are using to pass to the app component as parameters through this on login callback. So now we are passing to the app component most updated value of email and password. So this is the basic idea that I wanted to share with you all related to the useReducer, how it can be used to get the most updated state, and in which situations it has to be used, and how we can pass the values using callback to the app component. Okay, we are done with this. Now let's move to the app component. Okay, now this is the app component. Okay, in this app component, what we are implementing is, okay, so we can see over here that we have used a dummy admin. So if the value that I have entered inside the input fields matches the value of the admin, then only we can successfully log in. So the email for the dummy admin is this, and the password is this. Okay. Now over here, I am using a JavaScript concept of local storage. This is very important. So we are using the local cache to that is present inside the window object to store my admin. And to store this JavaScript object, we cannot directly store it. We have to convert this into a string using json.stringify, and that particular string can be then stored inside the cache corresponding to this particular key, which is admin over here. Okay, so this is how we can set a key value pair, that is a string, and corresponding to admin string, I have stored that particular string, which is the detail of the admin, using this function that is setItem, which is a function related to window.local storage. So local storage is a functionality that is available to this window object, which is a global object. Now let's proceed with the next part. Okay, so over here, now I am going to deal with the validity. So valid display. Okay, sorry. Oh, now this valid display will be true only if the value that we have entered inside the input fields are true, or is the value corresponding to the admin that has been stored inside the local cache. So I'm going to receive the values that has been passed with the help of a callback inside email and password. Then what I'm going to do, I am going to get the value that has been stored inside the local cache with a key which is admin. So I want to get that particular string that has been stored corresponding to admin. So for that, window.localstorage.getItem admin. So if I write this, I will get this particular thing that has been stored in the local cache. And finally, as it is a string, I need to parse it. That is, I need to convert it into a JavaScript object. And finally, the updated object is being stored inside admin. Okay. Now, what I need to check? I need to check the value that I have passed to the app component using the callback, which has been stored inside the email and the password, whether they are equal to the value that has been stored corresponding to admin inside the local storage. Now I have extracted the admin details. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do admin.email if it is strictly equals to the email that has been sent to the app component from the login component using callback. And similarly for the password, if the password is same, then I'm going to set valid display to true. And if it is not same, that means that the value that has been entered inside the input tags are not corresponding to the genuine admin which is being stored inside the local storage. Then the set valid display will be false. If it is false, then I am surely going to display the login part again. And if it is true, then I am going to display the home. So this is conditional rendering that is being done based on checking whether the value that I have entered inside the input tags and on clicking on the submit button, which I have received inside the app component, is equals to the value that is being stored for the admin in the local storage. So this is the basic idea and the basic concept that I needed to discuss with you all regarding the useReducer hook. And over here, we have used another important concept, that is the local storage. So you can find about this in details if you search in Google about local storage, JavaScript local storage. So there are a lot of more functions other than set item and get item. The set item is used to create a key value pair. So the key is admin and the value corresponding to it is the string. That is the details of the admin. And over here, I can easily access that using get admin, then writing the key. So this is the basic idea that I wanted to discuss about local storage. So I have given you an overview of what local storage is, how it can be used to store the values and to access those values, and then do some matching, and then finally log in a particular individual if the credentials are right. So this is the basic idea that I wanted to discuss. Now let's have a look at one more important factor. Let's delete this. Let's get back to the browser. Okay, I have to change this. Okay, over here, if I go to security, no application. Okay, if I go to the application, you will find storage over here. If you go to local storage, you will find the local host 3000. If you click on it, you can see the value that has been stored inside the local storage cache. That is, email is this and password is this. And this is the entire object which has been stored corresponding to the key, that is admin. So admin is the key and this is the key value pair. Okay. So this has been stored in the cache and we can extract that using get item and then writing the key corresponding to it. And finally can check whether the values that I have entered inside the input is true or not. That is, it is one of the admins or not. If it is true, then obviously successfully logged in will be displayed. So this is the basic idea about today's demonstration. That is how to use useReducer, how to implement it, how it can be used to eliminate the use effect and the useState hook. So we have got an understanding about each of them in details. When to use useReducer. We have also seen two conditions in which we need to use a useReducer or it is more preferable. And also we have discussed about the local storage, how we can store values in the local storage and how we can retrieve them. So I hope that this was a very much informative lecture for you all. In the upcoming videos, we are going to discuss more fascinating concepts in React. Till then, stay tuned.